Please, Daryl, start your presentation. It's your floor.
Thank you very much, Sven. Welcome, colleagues. Really nice to have you here and join us with this webinar. I'm going to move fairly quickly through the slides because there's a number of us presenting, and I don't want to waste time with trivia. So the picture you see is fairly typical penguin colony in South Africa, sorry, in Namibia. Not too different to what you'll see elsewhere in that part of the continent. Oh. Now it's got a bit jammed. Sorry, I've had there we go, a few technical challenges. So why bother? Why have a project at all on penguins, and why call it African penguins and the blue economy? Just by way of some background very quickly, and I'm sorry if those of you who might be religious and go to church and your minister uses lots of alliteration, you can see there's lots of E's there, wasn't deliberate. Penguins are endemic, occurring only in South Africa and Namibia. They're regarded as endangered. The population has reduced significantly over the last 100 years. There's less than 3% remaining, and some people are predicting that during our lifetimes, penguins will disappear. That species of penguin will disappear in the wild. Lots of reasons why they're under threat. Traditionally, it used to be interference at the colonies. They removed eggs. They removed guano. More recently, it's issues around overfishing, climate change, changes in the prey availability, namely sardines and anchovy. That's really affected them. They're important not only for ecosystem reasons, and I refer you back to our workshop presentation. We send you copies there if you want more information. They're not only valuable in terms of the provision that they make in the areas around the colonies, in terms of guano runoff, but also very much it's been shown that they're sentinels of ecosystem health. Not only are they valuable from an ecological perspective, but they're also valuable from an economic perspective. For example, there are, of the most colonies, 25, 26 colonies that occur off the coast of South Africa, almost all but 2 of them are on offshore islands. Those 2 that are on the mainland, which is just outside Cape Town, are major tourist attractions and bring significant financial revenue to those parts of the country. So they have a value both ways. We know a lot about some of the factors that drive population trends, and government and NGOs have been very active in trying to address the threats that they face. We don't know too much about their health. There have been some studies done, usually on penguins in rehabilitation colonies, although some work has been done. But we don't have much of an idea as to what factors play a role from a health perspective in either reducing or improving the sustainability of the population. And then we got a shock when there was a major avian influenza outbreak in South Africa in domestic poultry, and it spread across through probably some intermediate bird species to the penguins in South Africa and in Namibia. And the picture that you see in the slide was taken on one of the colonies off Luderitz in Namibia. And you can see a typical colony in the background, and a lot of penguin carcasses on the left and on the right when they were burnt. And it raised the question, well, how prevalent is this disease? What are the threats that these birds face from similar diseases, and how do we address them? And so what we did was, in 2018, 2019, we held a number of workshops in Cape Town involving a wide range of people, from researchers to NGOs to government policymakers to field people actually involved in the colonies themselves. And the purpose of those workshops, the first one was really a brainstorming one, the second one focused on avian flu. But out of that collaborative effort, both then and subsequently, we identified a number of projects that we've grouped under this title, African Penguins and the Blue Economy. And that's the list of them, and that's essentially what we're going to present to you today. And I'm just saying it like that at the outset because you can see from that that this project is very much a collaboration. It wasn't one single person drafting everything. When we talk about co-design, we've got these separate overlapping projects, and each person is heading up one of these projects or measures, and are bringing their own team to the table to do that work. So we have been under the MeerWissen label and driving these projects, particularly the ones on toxic chemicals, surveillance, modeling, and stakeholder analysis. The avian flu has been largely addressed through a similar overlapping project, but funding elsewhere. And we're now in the process of implementing. It's taking much longer than we thought. COVID, of course, has really wrecked our plans to head to the field. And also we ran into some regulatory challenges. But I'm pleased to say that Laura, who's going to speak next, started the survey work last week for the first time. So she's fresh from the field. The project has really started. And we're now in the process not only of implementing these projects, but looking for funding to do some work on the biobank samples. So very briefly, that shows you in that slide what the projects look like. You can see there's 3 measures, measure 1, 2, and 3, that collect data, assess data. And the idea is we're feeding into measure 4, which is a computer modeling project that will assess existing models, gather the data from the projects that we've undertaken, and then we'll use that to inform modeling going forward. And the whole idea is to be able to understand what the impact of health-related factors are on penguin population sustainability. And then you can see that all these measures are in the context of advocacy and stakeholder engagement. So this project in its overall context is very much around coming alongside government, policymakers, agencies, and using the data that we gather to help them improve and add to their work. So you can see one of those projects under stakeholder analysis is also included in today's lineup. So without further ado, I want to hand over immediately to Dr. Laura Roberts, who's a veterinarian in the Western Cape and is currently doing her PhD in the University of Pretoria on African penguin health, particularly around avian influenza and its management. Laura, over to you.
Thanks very much, Daryl, and thanks everybody for being here. So this is my measure as part of one of the chapters of my PhD, which all sprung out of the 2018 and 2019 outbreaks in African penguins of the avian influenza. So our primary priority is to have a look at avian influenza in penguins, in African penguins. Before 2018, we'd never found any signs of it. There was no evidence in any similar species north of the subantarctic that had avian influenza. So we want to see what's left over, what happened in the broader population, and assess what's happening now, because we know that avian influenza is changing rapidly. We're getting new subtypes, and it's spreading, and there's could be a lot more to learn. And in that, try and learn what colonies could be most affected, what in the penguins themselves could make them more susceptible. So we've got some options, more options in future to deal with a future outbreak. Next is something we know, an aspect we know is a problem in penguins, especially captive penguins, but we need to know more about what's happening in the wild, and that's blood parasites, hemoparasites, to look at what happens in wild populations and how this is something that can be quite affected by climate change and how that could happen in future. And then because we are going out and catching so many penguins, and because we don't want to disturb them more than necessary, we're taking samples to study other diseases that could cause problems in future, and that we picked up evidence of infection in the past, but can now take some samples to try and investigate further. Next slide, please. It hasn't changed on my side. I don't know if anybody else can. There we are. So this is our plan of action. First of all, credit to Rob Crawford and his co-workers for the maps. I've shamelessly edited and adapted, but all the credit to them. There's South Africa, and you can see from Port Elizabeth down to the southeast, up to Lüderitz in the northwest is where African penguins breed. As Daryl said, they only breed in colonies along that coastline, so they're very special. And our plan is to sample to distribute our samples as evenly as possible over that range. So we're treating the Namibian population and the South African population as separate. And we want to sample roughly 380 birds from each population. And we haven't been allowed to go into some of the smaller colonies because they're already so vulnerable. But we will be sampling all the major colonies, which comes to about 5 sites in the end. 5 sites in the Southwestern Cape. There's one in the Eastern Cape, Bird Island, which is the most important there. And then up in Namibia, we're aiming to get to the 4 important islands there. So the Namibian samples will be handled at the University of Namibia, and we'll handle our South African samples down here, and it's a great opportunity for collaboration there. So for the bird flu, the avian influenza, we need blood to have a look at previous exposure, to look at antibodies, and we need swabs from the mouth and from the cloaca, which are the primary sites where the virus could be shed if it's there. But once we've got that blood and once we've got those swabs, we can store them and freeze them and look at a whole lot of other diseases in future. And while we're there, we take their body weights, we do a quick clinical exam to assess health. You can actually, in penguins, match up their beak measurements, which indicate what their body size should be and their weight, so we can assess body condition in that way. It's a more objective way of doing it. And we will be taking any other useful samples while we're there, like feces and parasites. And on to the next slide to show you what we've done so far. So Dasson Island is where I was last week and where we finally made the start. Dasson is on our west coast. You may have heard of Robben Island, just outside Cape Town. It's the next big island to the north. And Dasson Island is quite different. It used to be covered in penguins 100 years ago, and you could hardly walk there. Unfortunately, now it's very different. It is still the penguins are still there. They're just very hard to find. They're under bushes and in holes. And you can see to the right what is required to get the penguin out of the hole so that you can sample it. It sometimes needs 2 people right up to their waists and poking around in the dark. Next to the left, you can see us taking the swab samples. So one swab goes down into the windpipe and up into the nasal passages, which are up in the top of the beak in a penguin. And then the bottom one is the one that everybody was horrified to start off with. The people helping me is the cloacal sample. And then another thing that has been tricky, but we think we've got it right now, is to get a big blood sample. So we can safely take 20 mils of blood from a penguin, which provides us with enough serum to do all sorts of tests if we can handle it properly and store it properly. But it does require that very special holding of the penguin, as you see there. So we want to be quick and efficient so the penguin doesn't have to sit like that for too long. But we've done our 43 down in South Africa, 340 to go. But it was exciting finally to get started after COVID and getting all our permits. And then next of all, on the next slide, which I can't see yet. I'm sure it's coming. This I had to put in because I was quite proud of myself. I'm not a person who's ever worked in the lab, but we had some wonderful donations from Labatec, a company in South Africa, via a German manufacturing company called Hetig, sorry, I've remembered, of 2 very expensive and very nice centrifuges for spinning down blood and allowing us to preserve very nice samples. So that's just showing you the setup there. We've got our blood tubes that we spun down in the one centrifuge. The other one lets us get smaller blood samples for assessing general health of the penguins and the composition of the blood. And we've got 100 blood smears there, 3 for each bird to go off to whoever needs them. And we've got a pack of serum there all ready for freezing. And I think Daryl is hinting that my time is up. But that's where we are. It's all very exciting.
Many thanks, Laura. No, it wasn't deliberate, I promise. Entirely finger trouble. Thank you, Laura. We'll come back for questions and answers at the end. Folks, I'm going to hand over immediately now to Professor Leslie Petrick, who is a chemist from the University of Western Cape. Leslie, I don't want to steal her thunder. She's done some very interesting studies in fish. And I'll let her say a little bit more about that presentation. Leslie, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daryl. I hope everybody can hear me. So our project in Measure 2 is to assess the presence and potential impact of the toxic chemicals arising from human activities on the African penguin, and to see whether that impact is due to the proximity to human settlements, and use the data to help formulate conservation policies. Next slide, Daryl. So just while the slides change, a little bit of background. We've done quite a bit of surveys on mussels and limpets. Daryl, next slide. We've done quite a few surveys on mussels and limpets and seaweeds and fish around the Cape Peninsula. And we have found that they are contaminated with a wide variety of pharmaceutical compounds. And we're seeing that these compounds bioaccumulate at the trophic level. So we're pretty sure that the birds are going to see the same kind of effect. What we want to do is to try and understand whether it might be affecting the sperm and the motility of the sperm. And we also want to try and understand to what extent the compounds are bioaccumulating in various organs of the birds, and whether there are things like antibiotic resistant microbes in their feces, to see whether the antibiotics that they're getting in are starting to create antibiotic resistance. So at the moment, the work that's underway is we've done site visits to 2 ocean aquarium and to Sandkop to start teaching the students how to do the sample collections and how to do this dissection of the carcasses. The semen sample collection is quite an art, and I'll leave it there. But it will take us a bit of work to get everything sorted out. We've worked with Sandkop on the dissection of the carcasses, and we're working with one of the experienced people at Sandkop to do the dissection. And the idea is to select different portions of the carcass to examine. We're only working with birds that have died, so we are the semen will possibly be harvested from live birds, but the rest of the work is done from birds that have died from natural causes or disease. We don't go killing birds. Most of our lab orders have been delivered. We've done some permit applications, and we're awaiting some of the outcomes there. These things take quite a while to organize. And we've also we're awaiting the outcome of the second ethics application. The first application has gone through, and the calibration standards for the analytical chemistry are ordered, but we're waiting for their delivery. Next slide. Thanks, Daryl. So while Daryl talks about that, we've had quite while Daryl gets the next slide up, we've had quite a bit of interest from the students, and I'll show you which students are being involved at the moment. The research proposals have been compiled, and I've sent those to Daryl and to Marcus to have a look at. We've submitted the project and thesis titles to the faculty to be registered, and the students have completed their MOUs in some cases. And they were involved in the site visits to the ocean and Sandkop, and they're involved in the tissue collection and dissection and the training, and also learning how to do the sample extraction, because analyzing for these chemical compounds is quite an art. I must just mention that we've selected a whole range of different pharmaceuticals and personal care products and antibiotics to test for. And for each one of those compounds, we need to find commercial standards that are pure so that we can calibrate our equipment and identify the compound and quantify it. So it's not a very quick process. For the Siemens work, that will be done under the leadership of Professor Liana Maria at UWC, and she will be studying the motility and the characteristics of the semen to see how the semen behaves when it's exposed to different doses. So that will be an in vitro study where the semen is exposed to particular compounds or concentrations of different compounds. Next slide, please. So this just gives you the composition of the team as it stands at the moment. Stephanie Dreyer has just started getting her PhD sorted out. Suzanne is more or less into her literature review already and getting her chemicals and things organized. Farron Hardnick is the student that will be doing the spermatology study. And Justin Moser at the moment is still registering for his PhD, so he's going to be involved in the project. Stephanie Dreyer is an avian physiologist, if one can call her that, and she's going to look at the gastrointestinal system of the birds, also from the physiological point of view. And hopefully that will give us some interesting information if there are any structural defects visible there. Farron will compare the spermatozoa studies between different trophic levels as part of her PhD, which will extend her work a bit beyond the scope of this project. Thank you very much.
Leslie, thank you. That was great. Thank you. Folks, I'm just going to now move us on to the next one, which is the third sub-project. I've just got one slide on it very briefly because it's at an early stage. And this talks to the need for surveillance. So when the avian influenza outbreak happened in wild birds, the first indication was mass mortality. And so one of the needs that was identified at the workshop was the necessity of being able to monitor birds along the coastline, particularly birds that are washed up dead, and have some measure of it. Now, there already are a number of tools that people can use to report dead birds, but nobody is reporting when they don't find dead birds. There's no denominator data. So this project here, the first part, is to develop an app that we can make use of citizen science to report what they find on the beaches, be they washed up birds, be they no dead birds. And we can use that then to be able to get estimates of local populations and also then monitor changes in both mortality and morbidity as hopefully an early sign that there's a problem in the birds. And of course, from a climate change perspective, from monitoring populations, it's also very valuable. And we're also hoping to include other reporting agencies. People report whales, seals, other reptiles such as sea turtles, and so that we will have one combined tool that everybody can use. That's still at the discussion stage. We hope to run a workshop. We should have ran a workshop last year, but COVID stopped that. So that's on the agenda for later this year. The other one then is very much in its preliminary stage, and it's the idea of trying to say on these remote colonies, particularly where there's not much human activity because of their remoteness, can we use drones? And the project is very much around both looking at what the paperwork tells us we can or can't do, but also trying to have a proof of concept to see, is it possible to have solar governed drones that go up 3 times a day, 4 times a day, take photographs, upload them, and from that will provide data in real time. That's the vision. The proof of concept, we'll see how feasible that is. So that's the third sub-project. Without further ado, then the fourth one is Professor Marcus Doher. Marcus was a guy that we got involved at an early stage in this project, and he's been wonderful in giving us support from the German angle. He is the head of the Epidemiology Institute at Freie Universität in Germany. Marcus, it's a pleasure having you. Thank you for being involved, and over to you.
Okay, thank you, Daryl. Thank you to everyone for attending this session and giving us the opportunity to present. Daryl, in the introduction, already pointed out in that graphical view of how the different measures interlink, that we are going to use modeling to try to use data collected in the different parts of the project, but also other data for predicting the penguin population health, but also future predicting in the future. Just a few words towards modeling. Models are simplified or virtual descriptions of reality, and to the right, I try to envision that by using that our old vision of a model with certain characteristics. Models are wrong, but some are useful, and we use models for different things. We see it in the COVID-19 outbreak now, that we use models for immediate action in outbreaks. So we have a modeling, quick response modeling with often lack of data or not very precise data yet. They are simple. They are designed for rapid emergency decision support. Whether that's helpful or not is a different issue. And some of these models, as I said, might be very wrong and proven to be very wrong in the end. We also use models for long-term predictions, for example, population viability, population survival, disease spread in populations. These more long-term predicting models, they need more data. They need better data often. They are more complex in structure. But then if the data is there, they can be used for population management scenarios. So we can also test out run scenarios and see how that would potentially impact populations. And they also require, because the data, they are data heavy and they need precise data also, they certainly require stakeholder input for the collection of the data, but also for assuring that the model needs or meets the needs of all individuals involved, and not only meets the needs of the modelers themselves. Next slide, please. So if we look at that graph here, I try to picture in the center, we have the modeling experts, and in our project, we have a group of international experts. Some of them have already worked with modeling penguin populations or comparable populations. Others are working themselves into it. We have on the left side the stakeholders, and here stakeholders, I put that very broadly because stakeholders, as Daryl already pointed out, could be very broad. That definition could be whoever is at any level interested, from governmental agencies through touristic information or organizations, etc., interested in the population, the penguin populations that we are talking about. So these stakeholders, they have certain needs, they have certain activities, and we need to extract from them in order to make the models that are developed useful and the results useful. We need to involve them early in the modeling stage to identify their questions, also identify the data that are available through them, and identify limits in terms of scenarios. So it doesn't make sense to model scenarios that are then considered to be completely out of question because they are out of the framework of whatever can be considered in terms of either actions to support the populations, etc. And then on the other side, we get, once the data are compiled, once the models are adapted, we get predictions, we get scenarios out of these modelings. They have their uncertainties. We can identify data gaps and limitations, both in terms of the scenarios or in terms of the models. And that needs to be linked back and communicated with the stakeholders. Next slide. This is an example not from the African penguin population, but from a publication on prediction of the Adelie penguin population at Edmondson Point. And I just want to use that to emphasize that at the top, there are several scenarios of the population survival. under different climate model conditions. So each of the lines represents a different climate condition, but then and that's something that we are also planning to do, then they added scenarios with catastrophic events thrown in, such as disease impacts. And they have two different scenarios on the occurrence with a certain frequency of catastrophic events and see how that affects the population viability. And that's exactly the framework that we are going to look at. We have constant pressure on the population, but we also have these disease-related events that we are trying to assess in terms of the avian flu, the impact of the disease, and then model that, throw that into the population-based models to see how these populations behave under general pressure plus catastrophic events. Next slide. So the plan that we are going to run through is that we extract the stakeholder information needs, and for that we had scheduled, and we are now going to try to do that as best as possible under the limitations of COVID-19 restrictions, extract stakeholder information through expert consultation workshops, so discuss with all stakeholders that are interested in terms of specific questions, what they need, where they see the population management going, etc. Then select through literature review and our expertise within the team, select and adopt suitable population models, and then expand them so that disease events, stochastic events can be thrown in. Identify the data needs and available data, maybe identify options to collect additional data or to make necessary assumptions. And then we are going to run the scenarios and communicate the results back to the stakeholders. And I see that as one of the crucial points, because communicating modeling results back to stakeholders is always a challenge. And last slide, please. So because I think, first of all, stakeholder involvement is important. It is an important component in all modeling activities, because the stakeholders are the ones that should tell us modelers which questions should be answered and also which questions can be answered. This is something that we then say. And the data, we can tell which data are needed, and they can also inform us which data can be provided and what should be communicated. So is it best to communicate average scenarios, extreme scenarios, results, and by whom to whom? So all these things that we need a close interaction with the stakeholders, and that's what we are aiming at within this project. Next slide. And with that, more or less, we are driving more or less the modeling, looking at the time, and also having that interaction with stakeholders, and we'll see how that fits together under the conditions that we currently have. But I'm very positive that we get that going in the near future. And I think that is almost it. Next
Marcus,
slide.
thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Marcus. Folks, we now move to the last project that we're going to discuss today. I just want to know, because I can't see the participants, has Takdira joined us?
Yes, I have.
Oh, excellent. Okay, thank you, Takdira. Lovely to see you, or lovely to hear you. I can't see you yet. So Takdira is doing her master's project through the University of Pretoria. And like Laura, she comes from last week, I suspect, Takdira, with her neck deep in birds. She's working as a volunteer at SANCOB, which is the major NGO that we're partnering with for this project. And they've had a bit of a crisis because they've taken in well over 1,000 or 1,500 chicks that were abandoned, chicks of another endangered seabird, one of the cormorant species in South Africa. And so Takdira has been helping there and in between trying to work on a master's project. So she's doing a master's with us at the Wildlife Centre at the University of Pretoria. And for a master's project, she's undertaking one of the stakeholder projects that we're doing. So without any more, over to you, Takdira. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dado. Hi, everyone. So I'm Takdira. My project will be on the assessment of stakeholder views in the conservation of the African penguin. Like Daryl has mentioned before, the African penguin population is endemic to South Africa and Namibia, but 77% of the population actually resides within South Africa. South Africa has the biodiversity management plan for the African penguin, but unfortunately the objectives and aims of the biodiversity management plan wasn't reached in the extended time period, so they had to extend it, and this prompted the drafting of a second biodiversity management plan. Next slide, please. Right, so the biodiversity management plan for the African penguin highlights the need for coordinated research action and gaps in research. We have taken this as an opportunity to base our research on stakeholder engagement. The aim of the study, the aim and objectives of the study is to assess the levels of awareness of the plight of African penguins amongst local stakeholders and the perceptions on current strategies to halt the decline and the priorities and challenges needed in the conservation of the African penguins amongst specialist stakeholder groups. Next slide, please. Right, so we have identified two different stakeholder groups. We have identified our specialist stakeholder group, which will be experts, researchers, people working with penguins, NGOs, government officials, and policymakers, and also fishermen, and our local stakeholder groups, which will be members of the public, people living close to mainland colonies, and just the general public. Next slide, please. Right, so people and penguins. So the overlapping between people and penguins has led to opportunities and challenges. Of the opportunities, we've seen through tourism and job creation, and some challenges is the human-wildlife conflict between penguins and residents of mainland colonies. Another major conflict is the competition between commercial fishermen and penguins for the same resource, and thus the marine protected area management, which has yielded significant results with experimental fishing closures surrounding the main breeding colonies, but has failed to take into account the human dimensions in a constitutional South Africa where small-scale fisheries were previously excluded. Next, yeah. So what does the survey intend to find out? From our experts, we want your opinions on the current conservation strategies and challenges faced to achieve the biodiversity management outcomes. For fishermen, we want general attitudes towards fishing policies and attitudes towards penguins and other wild populations. And the local people, we want their attitudes towards living in proximity to colonies and the general attitudes and knowledge towards penguins and conservation. Thank you. And I just ended off with saying that human dimensions to conservation takes an ecosystem approach, breaching the gaps in the research. Man needs to be recognized for the role played in the ecosystem and thus needs to be included in the management making processes that follow.
Thanks, Dr.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Folks, we're out of time. So very briefly, what are the next steps? First of all, of course, we've got to beat COVID. That's an international issue. It's constrained this project, but it's great, as you'll see, that things are actually moving forward. We have 2 years to complete these projects, so we've really got to focus on getting them done in time. We have been at the workshop that was held over a year ago now, and we've been broaching it with GIZ to see can we join with the Namaris project, because that's working in Namibia. So there's a lot of synergy between the stuff that we're doing. And we've got to find funding to test the samples. And of course, ultimately, the objective is to do our bit as a collaboration to save the penguin. So that's it. Thank you very much. I'm going to end the slideshow and I'm going to stop sharing so that we can have discussion. Thank you, Sven.
Thank you so much, Daryl, Laura, Leslie, Marcus, and Takdira for the fantastic presentation. So time is running. We have now maybe 15 minutes for the discussion, and I would like to ask you to turn on your camera. It makes and to see your faces, and it would make it maybe a little bit easier to have a vivid and interesting discussion. So please join with your camera on, and I would like then to ask you questions to our colleagues. And so please, let's start the conversation. And please raise your hand. Kira, I see Kira. Maybe you can ask your question, please.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm sorry, I don't have a camera, so I can't turn myself on, but I'm waving to you. Thanks, first of all, to the team for a really great presentation. I really enjoyed that. It's nice to catch up. Nice to see that you've made a start. On the Nomaris project, we are just starting also the project, so I very much look forward to exploring ways in which we can cooperate. I do see that there are many points or shared interests, shall we say, certainly in terms of, what's the value of penguins to society, how can we express that value, how can we elevate appreciation, I guess, of penguins in Namibia and in South Africa. So that's just a general sort of, words of appreciation and thanks. But I also have a specific question to Takdira. I wanted to ask you, in the survey that you are proposing, which I think is great, it's really, really useful. You mentioned that you are interested in attitudes. Would you also be able to or willing to include some questions specifically on how these different stakeholders actually value the penguins, in terms of, what is it that they really appreciate about them? In order to ask, is it just the monetary thing? Is it just, tourism and income? Or is there something else, maybe some other way of appreciating these animals? Thanks.
Yes, I think that would be a good question to include. We basically want to get their overall attitudes to assess, because we believe attitudes can affect their behavior. So I think that would be a useful question to include. Thank you.
Thank you, Takdira. Did that answer your question, Kira?
Absolutely, that's great. Thank you.
Great. So, Agostino, you are the next in line.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me?
Yes. You can ask your question. Can you hear us? Unfortunately, the connection is not working. We can't hear you, Agostina. So there seems to be. Now you are on mute. Maybe you can try it again. You are on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about it. Probably my headphones were not working. No, I just must admit I'm absolutely ignorant about penguins, so I learned quite a good deal today. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. And I'm also very impressed that you are doing already so much despite the situation, the pandemic and so on. And in this respect, I wanted to ask you if there was anything you had planned in these first months and you could not do because of the pandemic. I think this is more a curiosity because, somehow might reassure me and my group and my project about things we are probably failing on, this due to the pandemic. Just a comment on that. And then I have also just another curiosity taken from an ignorant person, whether the fact of, taking the penguins as an impact on the organisms, or maybe that it's acceptable because anyway, we want to understand what are the things that might be killing these organisms. So if you can comment on these two things. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll start off then and let the other team members come in. You're asking what's been delayed. Yes, there's lots been delayed. We meant to do the field work. We've got a very narrow window to do the field work, depending on when the breeding cycle is, when the penguins come on land. So we are quite confined, and really we had hoped to start last year with the actual field work, which has been delayed. Now, in a sense, by happy coincidence, we ran into some regulatory challenges, and this maybe talks to your second question in terms of the impact of the survey on the birds. We had originally intended to do 3 different cohorts of penguins. So we were going to take the South African population and divide it into 2 groups geographically. But the one group where the majority of the penguins are now actually breeding, the local governing agency wouldn't allow us to sample there because of the potential disturbance to the colony. So the population on the major colony has crashed, and they don't know why. And they're worried that just going onto the island and catching birds will affect their breeding. It will make the chicks vulnerable to predation, and therefore they didn't want us to go on. And we have to then join with other projects. So we have recruited a scientist whose sole job is really to monitor disturbance and to make sure that we don't adversely affect the colonies. Okay. Does anybody else want to add to that? It was obviously profound.
Yep, you covered it.
Cool.
Great, thank you, Daryl. Are there any other questions? Kira, your hand is raised, but maybe it's from before. I don't know.
I'm sorry, that's a mistake. I forgot to take it down.
Okay,
yeah,
thank you. Is there anybody else who would like to ask a question? Anke?
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. And I have a question to Leslie, particularly, I think. So out of interest, how do all the chemicals and the chemicals, sorry, and pharmaceuticals actually reach the environment and the penguins? And it's probably from industry or sewage, I would guess. And are the polluters aware of the problem, and are they kind of involved, or is this problem tackled by anything? Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Okay, that's an interesting question. I'm sorry, I don't have a video camera, so I can't switch it on. But the pollution is usually what people are using. And it's usually coming into the oceanic environment through the sewage or through pollution into rivers and stormwater drain. Our studies have shown that exactly the same chemicals that are present in sewage are being found in the marine environment. So we're pretty sure that the chemical signature from sewage is reporting to the ocean. And, you know, in Cape Town particularly, most of our sewage is actually discharged into rivers that are then discharged into estuaries or into the surf zone. And then we have got several marine outfalls where the sewage is not even treated, it's just macerated and sent straight out into the ocean untreated. So the volumes of sewage from 4 million people is actually huge. And we're finding that chemical fingerprint right around the peninsula. We've studied the whole of False Bay, and we've seen pollution all the way from Miller's Point right across to Royals. And we've seen pollution of Camps Bay and Greenpoint. And it's definitely starting to bioaccumulate to the point where the risk factors that we're calculating are very high. In terms of our interaction, yes, we've been trying to work with the city to try and upgrade the wastewater treatment plants. But as you can understand, that's a very complex problem. The first issue is, of course, that there's no budget to put the right kind of advanced oxidation systems in place. The other point is that the city is, of course, denying it, and they attack us instead of listening to us. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie. Barbara, please.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you very much for a very, very comprehensive, interesting presentation. It's really great to see that you're getting on with the project despite all the challenges at the moment. So excellent news. I have a very small technical question to Laura, and then more a general remark regarding the blue economy dimension of the of the project. So I wondered for the sampling or for the testing of the birds that you catch alive. I mean, how do you make sure that you don't basically catch the same bird twice? I mean, that's just a small question, but I just wondered how you go about it. And regarding the blue economy question, I wondered in your stakeholder analysis and stakeholder communication, whether the tourism sector forms a separate group, so to speak, because that seems to me like maybe the most direct link to the blue economy, and it didn't feature, as far as I could see, as a separate group like tourism, private sector companies, but also and agents, but maybe also tourists themselves. So maybe that's something to take into account. Thank you.
I'll answer first. So I would like to do lots more boasting, but one of the extra things that we're actually doing is putting microchips in the penguins. So the same as you would put in a dog or a cat, tiny little, smaller than a rice grain. And actually it's one of the projects that we're working with has been putting these little microchips in penguins for some years now. Part of that is to actually monitor rehabilitated penguins and make sure that the rehabilitation efforts are successful and justified. But also they put microchips in the wild penguins for comparison purposes. So that's a project we're working with. And so any bird I handle, I will first scan for a microchip and record the number. And then if it doesn't have one, I'll put one in. So in the short term, we might use some marker paint or something, but for the longer term, we'll scan each bird. And to admit it, I still need the actual way of keeping that list of microchips to make sure. But we're hoping to do it in a short space of time, and for some of the more dense colonies, move through there in a short space, so not even go back to the same place. But yes, in short.
Shall I come in then with the second one? Barbara, we didn't include an assessment of tourism at this stage for two reasons. One was Takdira's project is very much around local people and the South African public's views and attitudes to conservation. Largely because there was a study done in the last couple of years, that assessed the economic value of at least the major penguin colony just outside Cape Town to the local sector. So this project that Takdira is doing is complementing by saying, okay, we've already got data on the value of tourism in the area, but there are significant issues around how local people see it, because their lives have been quite disrupted. People living close to the colonies, their lives are quite disrupted by both the tourists coming and penguins invading their gardens and their limitation of activities. So Takdira's project is outside that, but we certainly want to visit it in the future. And sorry, just to finish that, and it's largely around, they are establishing new colonies along the coast. And one of the questions we want to ask is the financial factor, the tourism incentive, one of the factors that's used in establishing where a colony is located, or is it simply on ecological and environmental grounds?
Okay, thank you, Daryl. Leslie, would you like to answer also the question because you raised your hand then, or is it a different question?
It's a different question.
Okay, then Jay is the next in line, and please ask your question, Jay.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really nice, and particularly for me because I have been working with stranding of marine animals in Brazilian coast, and stranding of Magellanic penguins was really dramatic. I mean, every year, and we did like very similar assessment, but a point that we didn't do, and I would like to have more about this from your side, is this blue economy. If there is something similar, what you guys propose going on in South Africa or in Namibia, and which is gonna be the targeting group of people that's gonna be benefit from this project?
Jay, who should answer the question?
Okay. Who is more involved in the blue economy part of the
Ken, sir, I didn't catch the question. If somebody else in the group caught it, maybe they can answer. Otherwise, Jay, you could repeat it, please.
Yeah, I would like to know the targeting group of the blue economy part of the project. The targeting people. Who is going to be which group of people?
So I'll maybe tackle that first. The project is set up explicitly to support government and the agencies working with penguins. So they're the target groups. The projects are set up to really come alongside them and give them data, information, evidence to help them in their work. However, the blue economy refers to the value of the penguin as a population. South Africa, as a developing country in Africa, has huge needs. And some people actually raise the question, why prioritize the penguin at all? We've got so many humanitarian needs. We've got job problems. We've got all sorts of other health issues in the country. We haven't got money for conservation. So we want to keep in mind very much the value and the role of penguins in contributing, not only ecologically, but also financially to the country to justify its status as being targeted for conservation measures.
Thank you, Daryl. We are already at the end. Maybe Leslie, if you have a short question or comment, please let us know, and then we would come to the end.
No, don't worry. I'll speak to the researchers directly. It's a question to Laura.
Okay, fine. If there are no urgent questions anymore, I would like to come to the end now and say thank you very much to Daryl, Laura, Leslie, Marcus, and Takdira, and for the great presentations and the great insights into the project activities and the measures you have already done. I think that you are on a good track, and we will follow it closely here. And if there are any questions, comments, and so on, please, we have MS Teams community here. You can raise your questions and have a discussion here as well in our MS Teams community. And to connect to each other, it would be really important to keep on going within MeerWissen, and we will continue definitely our webinar series in the future. I will keep you updated as soon as we have scheduled the next webinar. Please register if you have not done it yet in the schedule in our MS Teams community, and then we will send our link, send the link to join the webinar. So that's it for today. Thank you very much, and we hope we see you again at the next webinar, and stay healthy.
Thanks for organizing.
Thanks, bye.
Bye, thank you.